Thank you for reading that scripture for us this morning. How many of you have ever read the book entitled Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day? You ever come across that book? Okay. Well, it's a story about the life of an 8-year-old boy, and here's just a little excerpt from it. He says, "I went to sleep with gum in my mouth, and now there's gum in my hair. And when I got up in the morning, I tripped on the skateboard, and by mistake, I dropped my sweater into the sink while the water was running, and I could tell it was going to be a no good, very bad, horrible day. Things like that went on all day, and then came evening. There was lima beans for dinner, and I hate lima beans. There was kissing on TV, and I hate kissing. My bath was too hot. I got soap in my eyes. My marble went down the drain, and I had to wear my railroad train pajamas, and I hate railroad train pajamas. Then I went to bed. Nick took my pillow he said I could keep, and the Mickey Mouse light burnt out, and I bit my tongue. And the cat wanted to sleep with Anthony instead of me. It has been a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. I think I'll just move to Australia." Have you ever felt that way? Well, Jonah in our text today felt that way, except he didn't want to move to Australia. He just wanted to plain die. That's what his response. And I don't know about you, but to me, that kind of response is actually kind of boggles my mind a little bit. I mean, just to think about it for a minute. Here is a man who had just been miraculously saved after spending some time in the belly of a fish. A man who had just experienced the most intimate encounter with God through where God showed him his grace and his mercy and his forgiveness. And a man whose unpopular message was believed not by only one, but by an entire city. Now, as a pastor, I'm happy when I hear one or two people come to faith in Jesus Christ because of what I was saying. Here is 120,000 people, an entire city responded to the message that he had given. And it wasn't even a message of repentance. It was a message of judgment. But through that, somehow God worked through Jonah, and these people responded to his message. And yet, here we find him at a place where his heart is filled with anger towards God, showing his redemption, his forgiveness, his grace to this city of people. And so the first thing that comes to my mind, the question is why? Why did Jonah, a prophet of God, become angry when the people of Nineveh actually listened to the message and repented of their evil? And for me, there's one more obvious answer, and there's a couple, but there's one for me that stands out, and that is that Jonah clearly was struggling with an issue or an attitude of bitterness. Notice what the verse goes on to say. It says, he said he prayed. There's a little irony to that. I mean, he's angry with what's happened in Nineveh, and yet he's praying. He said, "Oh Lord, is this not what I said would happen when I was still at home? That is why I was so quick to run in the other direction." In other words, Jonah had not wanted the people of Nineveh to repent. He didn't like the people of Nineveh. He hated the people of Nineveh because of how evil they were and the things they had done to him and to his ancestors. And so when God decided to spare the Ninevites, every bit of anger in Jonah's heart erupted. Instead of rejoicing in God, once again proving that he indeed is a gracious, loving, and compassionate God, Jonah instead became angry. Now, maybe some of us will look at that and we think, well, that's hard to make sense of that. That a man who knew all this about God, he said, "I knew that's what you were going to do." And he knew in his own heart how God had done that in his own life. And yet when God did that in the life of the people in Nineveh, he found his heart angry towards the situation. And that's because Jonah was struggling with a bad case of bitterness or a spirit of unforgiveness. It wiped out the possibility of what he knew was true in his head to impact his heart. And the same thing can be true for us. That's why the Apostle Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, so emphatically, he says, "Get rid of all bitterness, because bitterness clouds our ability to see and to embrace the kindness and compassion and goodness of God in our lives." somewhere along the line, Jonah hadn't got to that point yet. And as a result, he missed out on the joy that could have been his to see a entire city become right before God. Even though Jonah had said yes to God the second time, he still hadn't come face to face yet with a bitterness in his heart towards these people. And unfortunately, when they changed their minds and God changed his heart towards the people of Nineveh, he found his heart erupting with a spirit of bitterness. And the only antidote that I know of and the Bible communicates to us for bitterness is forgiveness. Somewhere along the line, we've got to come to understand what forgiveness means and embrace that. Otherwise, bitterness will continue to fester within our hearts and lives. And so forgiveness is the attitude. The question I have for us this morning is, how do we get there? What do you and I need to think about forgiveness in order for us to be able to get to that place in our lives? The first thing I think we need to understand is that of our own indebtedness to the act of forgiveness. I think if we just stop and think for a minute, we all know that every one of us have had times in our lives of where we needed the grace of someone else. We needed the extension of forgiveness with someone else because of what we said or did. I'm sure we've all been in that place where we spoke too soon, we reacted too soon, or whatever the case may have been, and we needed their grace on our lives. We've all been there, I'm sure, every last one of us. I know as I look at my own personal life, I see many, many examples of where I needed the grace of someone else because of me speaking out of turn or acting in a way that was ungodly, was not gentle towards the other individual, especially my wife. She's had to extend grace to me many, many times, as have my sons. Unfortunately, I've had to go to my sons many times and ask for forgiveness because of overreacting or reacting harshly to something that was taking place. And so if we are to understand how we are to extend forgiveness to someone else, we need to, first of all, come face to face with the reality of how much we need the forgiveness of others in our lives. And most importantly, the forgiveness of God, right? That we need most importantly in our lives. But we all are indebted to the act of forgiveness by someone, especially God. And so when we struggle with forgiving someone because of what they said or done to us, this is the best place to start. Just simply take some time to think about how we are so indebted to other people's forgiveness in our lives. Some of us have been around for a few years, and I'm sure we've crossed paths with somebody in unhealthy ways, and we've had to ask for that forgiveness from them. Just remind yourself of those moments as you find yourself wrestling with someone who has offended you. Just think about how someone extended to you some forgiveness when you crossed the line. Another aspect of forgiveness that I think is so terribly important is a willingness to leave the things in the past behind. When I think of that, you probably heard the story of the Hatfields and the McCoys. They were a group of families that continued on their anger and bitterness towards each other, even though whatever had happened was ancestries ago, a long time ago. And the present generation was still arguing and fighting with each other and hating each other, but they didn't even know why anymore because it was something that happened way back then. But it was carried on. That family's mad at that family, and so I guess I got to continue it on. Terrible thing legacy to carry on. But that was what happened in that situation. And I think we need to recognize the very same thing for our lives is that if we want to move on, we need to be willing to leave the things in the past, and that comes through an act of forgiveness. It's not easy. Sometimes it's risky. Yes, sometimes it requires us to be cautious, depending on the offense. But in order to stop our hearts from becoming bitter, we need at some point in time to move to this level of forgiveness that God has extended towards us, in which he looks at our sin through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and he looks at them and saying, I remember their sins no more. Just as we had never sinned, as far as the east is from the west. Now note, he doesn't say he forgets. See, that's sometimes with the problem that we have. We think in order for us to forgive, we have to be able to forget. God can never forget our sin, our wrongdoings. And he's all-knowing, so he'll never be able to forget. But he says, I choose to remember no more. I choose to remember. And that's the challenge for you and I, that we need to get to the same place. And Jonah needed to do that, but he hadn't got there yet. We need to choose to be able to make that choice of forgiving those who are around us. It's a choice that we have to make. It's a willingness to decide, or a deliberate choice to go and choose to leave what somebody has done to us in the past. Now you may be saying, well, how when we do that, aren't we just taking the forgiveness a little bit too far? But think about it for a minute. You and I are going to live with the consequences of the other person's offense against us, whether we want to or not. We'll live with it one way or the other. We'll live with it in the context of bitterness, or we'll live with it in the context of forgiveness. Because the offense has happened. We've experienced it. It hurt. And so it will be with me. I can't get rid of it. I can't make it disappear. And so I have a choice to make. Do I want to live with it in a spirit of forgiveness, or do I want to live with it in a spirit of bitterness? That's the choice that we have. And forgiveness is what allows us to make that transition in our lives. And again, Jonah had not got there yet. And so for us this morning, the challenge is if you find yourself in a place of where your heart is stirred up with a sense of anger, or when somebody mentions a name or a situation or circumstance, and you find yourself beginning to boil within inside, a place to start is to move towards an attitude or spirit of forgiveness. Now the question is, how do we know if we've gotten to that point in our lives? Because we'll say, I've forgiven. But then we wrestle with, but have we actually? Like, how do we know that we've actually truly got to the place that we've extended forgiveness the way God has defined forgiveness to be within His Word? This might be a difficult one for you, because I'm still wrestling with it. I'll be honest with you, I'm there sometimes, but not all the time. I still struggle with this one. And it's simply this, is when we have fully come to the place of full forgiveness for what somebody's offense toward us, is when we're able to look at the offense and see how God used that offense in our lives for His good. Once we have got to that point, we have come to the place of where we understand what forgiveness truly is. That no matter what the offense that has been done toward us, that we're able to take that offense and look at it as something that God used in my life to maybe improve something that I needed to improve on, or at least to use it somehow for His good in my life and in the people that I live with. And a great example of that in the Old Testament is the story of Joseph. You all know the story, I'm sure. He was hated by his brothers, and they sold him as a slave, and all the things that Joseph went through. And yet the day came when they needed food from Joseph. And how did Joseph respond when he saw his brothers? He said, because they were afraid. When they recognized who he was, they were afraid. And he simply says, I want you to know that what you intended for evil, God used for good. That's forgiveness in its full expression. And like I say, I'm still wrestling there at times to get there. But it is a good indicator of whether or not we have truly, fully understood what forgiveness is all about. And that's where Jonah was stuck. That's where he was stuck. He couldn't get past that because of what had happened, how these people had lived their lives, and what they had done to his ancestors. He just couldn't get past that. And as a result, the amazing expression of God's grace and forgiveness and redemption, Jonah could not embrace it with enthusiasm, but rather his heart continued to be filled with anger. Which leads us to the question that God confronted Jonah with was this: have you any right to be angry? In light of all the grace and forgiveness that's been extended to you over the years, and definitely the forgiveness of God, he said, do you still have any right to be angry? And it's interesting how that Jonah says, yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. And of course, God had to correct that as well. But when I think of that, I reminded of the story of the unmerciful servant in the book of Matthew, how that when he was forgiven much by his boss, his employer, he couldn't translate that to how he should respond to the people that owed him money. He obviously didn't understand forgiveness that he had experienced. He hadn't engaged with that, and as a result, he wasn't able to extend forgiveness to the people that owed him money. Do we have a right to be angry? Do we have a right to hold on to our hurt? Is the question that we have to wrestle with in our own lives as well. As we move on to the story, we see that the next thing that happens is that God provides Jonah shelter from the sun by providing a vine to grow up around Jonah. Not sure exactly why God did that, but again, it's an expression of God's grace, isn't it? That even in spite of the fact that Jonah was angry with God and was having this argument with God, God still reaches out and recognizes Jonah's need and provides a vine to give him shelter. A man who had ran away from God's initial command then came back, and God spared him and gave him a second chance. Now he's at a place of anger, and yet God in all that still comes to him and said, Jonah, I'm going to give you a place of shelter under this vine. That's the God you and I serve. That's the graciousness, compassionate God that you and I are in love with. And all I can say this morning is that thank God he's gracious. Now, the result of this shade tree was that Jonah was extremely happy. He just was very angry, and now he was very happy. He was both extremes in his emotion. In verse 7, it says, But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the vine so that it withered. And when the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. To which Jonah responded by saying, It would be better for me to die than to live. To which God again says, Jonah, do you have any right to be angry? Do you see how that even though the vine situation had nothing to do with who he or what was going on in his life, had nothing to do with why he was bitter, it spilled over. And that's what bitterness does. If we hold bitterness to our hearts, there may be a particular situation or person that we may be struggling about, but I can guarantee you that other people that are close to you are going to be impacted by that. You just cannot keep it to yourself. You cannot keep it just to that situation. I'm just angry about that, and that's all I'd be angry about. It doesn't work that way. When anger becomes a part of our lives, it affects everything and everyone around us. And there's the same situation with Jonah. He had nothing to do with the vine. The vine had nothing. God just brought it up. But he was angry at the vine because of the fact of the bitterness he had within his heart. And so we need to recognize how dangerous that is in each one of our hearts and lives as well. Dealing with the hurts and offenses that are before us, before they turn into bitterness and turn into anger, is crucial for life of peace and tranquility. But there's something else that as I've been going through this particular story, that I find kind of interesting is Jonah's emotional roller coaster. His bitterness definitely was a major component to his anger, but I also think that he was also struggling a little bit with a focus issue. And let me explain what I mean by that. You notice how that his emotions changed so drastically from anger to happy to sad to anger to happy. He went back and forth, back and forth. And it's because I think the broader issue for him was the fact that his life was so much based on the circumstances around him. He was angry with the people of Nineveh because of what they had done to his ancestors. And so he runs in the opposite direction. And then we find that God responds to his message of judgment to the people of Nineveh, and he's angry about that. And he finds that he's continually making all his response and his view of life based on what's going on around him, rather than on the God who's behind all that. And again, I think that's the challenge that we have when we find ourselves in a place where we're struggling with our feelings and attitudes towards things and people. We need to find ourselves in a place where we need to take our focus off ourselves and put it back on the God who is gracious and compassionate in each and every one of our lives. Jonah, again, failed to do that. Even though he repented in the belly of the fish, he obviously had not got to the place yet of where you fully understand what it meant to live in the grace and the mercy of God. And so we find that Jonah was finding himself struggling with how he felt about the people of Nineveh and what was going on around him. When I think of the Apostle Paul, of course, we have the opposite, don't we? He says in Philippians chapter 4, he says, I've learned to be content in whatever circumstance I'm in. Whether I have lots or whether I have nothing or whatever, it doesn't matter where I'm at. Because what's the key? Because my focus is on him. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. That's why no matter what Paul experienced in life, he did not allow him to become angry or frustrated or disappointed, whatever. It didn't allow him to go there emotionally because his focus was on the one who says, I will give you the strength for whatever you need to go through in life. Again, Jonah had not got there yet. And it's unfortunate he was a prophet of God, but he struggled with that. And yet at the same time, I also want to encourage you, I want to present encouragement to you this morning, is this. We're all on a faith journey. Every one of us. Sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we don't. But we serve a God who is gracious and compassionate and forgiving. And he's given you and I an amazing promise. He says, I started a work in you, and I'm going to finish it. When you come see me face to face, the work I said I was going to do in your life will be done. To me, I take great comfort in that. I take great encouragement in that because I know how short I fall so many times and how much I rely on God's grace and mercy and forgiveness in my life. And sometimes I even get frustrated when why did I do that again? Why did I stumble there again? I knew better. But I went there again. And then God reminds me, it's okay. I love you. You're one of my children. And one day, you'll get it when you're with me face to face. Thank God we serve a gracious God.